Hi, I'm James Kotecki here in the C-Space Influencer Studio here at CES 2019, and with me is Stacie de Armas, VP Strategic Initiatives and Consumer Engagement at Nielsen. Did I get that all?
You did. That's
a
long title.
Right?
You got it.
So you just came off of a panel, I believe, talking about Latinx issues. First of all, is Latinx the appropriate name for the community? Is that the preferred term at the moment?
Well, I'll tell you at Nielsen, we actually use all the terms interchangeably, right? So we US Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx, but increasingly we're using Latinx because we've found that the community is really embracing it as they sort of put their arms around their LGBT brothers and sisters and non-binary, and it's also much more inclusive of women. You know, while Latino traditionally means any person, it does lean toward sort of a male, gender, and so it's a term that's commonly being used now in academia and writing, and so we've adopted it too, and we feel that it's really inclusive.
And so your panel that you just came off of was about Latinx engagement. What were some of the issues that were bubbling up on that panel? Well,
some of the really important things we talked about were how the community engages with tech differently, right? I think one of the most important things was that we learned that the community is a lot younger, but even when you look at same-aged Hispanics to non-Hispanic whites, you see all these differences in engagement with tech where you typically would imagine you wouldn't, right? You'd imagine folks that are 18 to 34, regardless of their ethnic background, would sort of have the same, tech adoption rates. If you're a millennial or Gen Z, you're going to adopt and engage sort of at the same rate, but that's not what we see. We see the Latinx community sort of way over-indexing for a lot of these digital social behaviors. So we set out in the last panel to understand why would this group be accessing tech and adopting at a different rate, and sort of what's driving that, and we did. And we had three.
So you solved it? You got
it? Solved. We solved it all.
Okay.
And so anyone's in the panel now knows. No, we really tried to figure out those behaviors, and what we landed on, we did this piece of research last year, Nielsen did, and the most important thing, there were many findings, but the most important thing that's influencing those over-indexings of behavior is culture. So there is, simply put, there is a predisposition among Latinos, regardless of generation or whether you're bilingual or English language, there's a predisposition to engage in social activity and dialogue, right? In real life, whether it's with friends and family, multi-generational households, and those same behaviors bleed over and extend into their use on digital and social platforms. So not just Facebook and Instagram, but also with how they engage with artists and celebrities and content. So it's a really interesting finding because it tells us that culture does drive attitudes.
So I have two questions about the overall Latinx community. Let's zoom out for a second and just contextualize the growth, the numbers in the United States, for example, and how that trajectory is going.
Okay, so in the US, the Hispanic community, the Latinx community, it makes up 18% of the population. But what's most fascinating is just in the past year, just last year alone, the Hispanic community contributed 51% of the total growth of the U.S. population. Wow. So of all the growth, 51% of it came from 18% of the population. So our community is growing a lot faster. And then people always want to know, well, why is that? Well, we have more people in childbearing age, which is one reason. It's really not immigration anymore, but it's this relative youth, right? The median age of Latinx community in the U.S. is 28. And the median age of non-Hispanic white is 43. Wow. So that leads to all sorts of things. One of them is population growth.
So that points to the future, and I'm wondering, at some point in the future, does it make sense to talk about this community as an overall entity? Because certainly there must be so much diversity within that 18% and growing. Does it make sense to kind of carve out that entity, or will there be kind of additional groups within that?
No, I think it really does, and I think more and more marketers and brands are looking at the community, sort of as a whole versus, Spanish dominant or English dominant or U.S. born or foreign born. But they're also really looking at the distribution of age, and that's one of the things we talked about in the panel, was that you have 60% of the U.S. Hispanic population under the age of 34, 60, compared to non-Hispanic white, where you're, maybe 40%, and it's such a significant difference. You're so loaded on the young age. You have, under 18, you have 33%. A third of the Hispanic population is under 18. Wow. So all of these digital behaviors, that's why we see so much more of them. It's not just the youth. Youth is a part of it, but the other part is that it's culturally familiar to engage more. So.
People think of tech as an overwhelmingly white entity.
They do.
Right? To the extent that that's still true, I assume to a large extent you would probably say that it is. Like, where is the influence going to come in, and at what point does this group get to a point of influencing and changing tech and culture, maybe more in ways that people understand now?
Well, we actually believe they already are, and part of the reason is this relative youth, right? When you have 60% of the population, again, as I said, under 34, you have not just this sort of rapid adoption based on youth, but you also have this pace setting for the rest of the community. So think about any group of young folks like millennials and or Gen Z, and you have a large majority of those kids being Hispanic, they are going to be pace setting for the rest of the group that they're in. And so while that may not be true in the older demographics, it is in the younger demographics. So our research shows that they're not sort of languishing behind the digital divide, but rather really pace setting in tech adoption.
And linguistically, what does that young group of, especially that third under 18 look like? Are they mostly bilingual? Or are they?
They are mostly bilingual. The majority of U.S. Hispanics are bilingual, but what's really fascinating is Latinos engage in language by choice, and they do it as an exercise in cultural connectivity. So think about like for me, when I want to connect, I can consume content that I want, and it gives me, it's more than just content, it sort of fills this need that I talked about earlier about, connecting, this predisposition I have to connecting. Certainly music is a great one. We can talk about Despacito or not.
But it's almost like, it's like this super language, right? Because if you're bilingual and you're communicating with someone else who's bilingual and you communicate in one language or another, the fact that you made the choice to speak in one language or another is itself communicating certain information, because they know you could have done both and they could have understood both. It
is, and it's interesting you say that, because in the circles that I'm in, which are largely people that work in Hispanic marketing and that are Hispanic in the spaces, I notice, it's actually really, I need to do a piece of behavioral research on this, but how we address and communicate with one another sort of sets a basis for an understanding, right?
Interesting.
It is. That's going to be my next research project.
Okay, great. I'm looking for co-author credit on that. If you get a chance. What are some mistakes that brands make when trying to engage with this community? I'm sure there are a lot of them.
There are. I think the biggest mistake is trying to engage in language rather than engaging in culture, right? Cultural nuance, that's where we get into, I think brands in the past have looked at the community and thought, well, I need to do, I have a Spanish language outreach, I have my English language outreach, when really you need to look at this community holistically, knowing that they engage in language by choice when and where they please. And so looking at the community that way and really approaching it more with cultural relevance and authenticity are really what's going to set apart those that win from those that don't.
Does your work with the Hispanic community have resonance or lessons for those working with other minority groups in the United States or elsewhere? And how does that cross over?
There are best practices and findings, I think, that we can look in both spaces. In my group, in diversity and inclusion, we work with African American, Hispanic, Asian, LGBT, veteran women. We have a lot of groups that we focus. And in some cases, we do see data that is similar. But really, the Hispanic community is just set apart in a lot of ways, and the two ways I think that are the most important, as I talked about, was this relative youth, which seems to drive everything, but how culture influences behavior, those behavior drivers, and those we see are different, and largely I think it's because language is the component there.
Is there another milestone or another moment that you're looking forward to in the future when this thing happens, then we'll really know that something is...
It's such a great question, because I've talked about it before, and I call it the sort of the next big demographic revolution. So if you know anything about demographic revolutions, there have been a couple of really big ones in history, right? There is the one around the Industrial Revolution, when we were able to process food better so people stayed alive longer, and we were able to pasteurize and do all these things. And we had this huge population explosion, and then we had another one around the baby boom. And I think people don't have real perspective as to just how many people were actually born. I mean, we increased the population by like 50%, so just incredible number, but just this one, this set of years. The next big demographic revolution is upon us, and it's with the growth of the Hispanic community. Right now, we're looking at 18 or 19%, but frankly, with 60% just under 34, right at the cusp of these major acquisition years, these big life decisions, childbearing years, I think we are just upon it, and it is right ahead of us.
The future is right ahead of us, and we really appreciate you sharing some insights.
Thank you so much.
Stacie de Armas of Nielsen, thank you so much for joining
Thanks
me.
for your time.
Well, thank you for being here with me and with Stacie in the C-Space Influencer Studio here at CES 2019. You can find more great C-Space influencer content at facebook.com/CES or on the CES website and all other great CES social channels. Thanks so much for joining us.